So the U.S. and Russia reached a deal on a ceasefire in southwest Syria ahead of President Trump and Putin's meeting. Tara Mahler is a former CIA analyst and spokesperson and senior policy advisor with the Counter-Extremism Project. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So there is some common ground there in terms of Syria and ISIS. Beyond that, though, their interests diverge a lot. What do you think of what happened today?
Sure. While I'm all for any ceasefire to try to put a stop to the violence that's happening on the ground in Syria, you're right. There are major areas of disagreement that still remain, and there are questions about any type of ceasefire. A ceasefire is only as good as the parties on the ground willing to follow it. So it remains to be seen if, in fact, the ceasefire will temporarily put a stop to the violence. And also, there are still outstanding issues here. There are significant differences of opinion with regards to Assad. The United States taking a much stronger stance against Assad than clearly Russia, who's basically supporting Assad. And then second, the United States has to put some more pressure on Russia with regards to Assad's use of chemical weapons, for example, something that Russia has turned a blind eye on. So still major areas of disagreement, but where cooperation can happen is on ISIS. And if it can happen, and if this ceasefire helps it to happen, then I'm all for it.
So, I mean, that's an important starting point. Both sides are very much opposed to everything that is going on with ISIS. I mean, ISIS poses a threat, radical Islam poses a threat to both Russia and the U.S. After that, they're fighting over territory, oil reserves within Syria. Also, Russia obviously wants to have a military foothold there as well. Is there a way to satisfy Russia's desire to be in that territory and to have that foothold, but to also achieve some of what the U.S. is after, Assad not gassing his people? Can those two objectives coexist?
Well, it's going to be very difficult to see the roadmap to get to that point. You're exactly right. What we see going on in Syria, aside from it being an ISIS safe haven, which is fortunately being reduced, it's somewhat of a proxy war there for countries like Russia, who have been propping up the Assad regime and not being helpful in terms of reaching a longer-term stable solution in Syria. And even if we make progress on the ground in Syria against ISIS with cooperation from the Russians, there's still a general fight against ISIS ideologically and globally that needs to take place online and fighting their ideology overseas. And that's really sort of the main concern, at least from a U.S. Homeland Security perspective, and over in Europe regarding homegrown terrorism, which will continue regardless of what happens on the ground in Raqqa or in Mosul. So I think you're right. I think this is a positive first step. A ceasefire is always a positive first step, but there's still a long way ahead, and a humanitarian crisis on the ground there in terms of civilians being displaced and killed.
And not only that, the deeper you go, the more complicated it gets. Even if Assad were taken out of the equation, which is obviously a huge if, you see Russia coming in and partnering with Iran. That sets them up against us and our potential allies or current allies in the region, whether you're talking about Saudi Arabia or you're talking about Israel, who, has been obviously violently butting heads with Iranian forces for so long. How do you resolve all of that and keep Russia in the mix so it's satisfied? Is there any way to do that?
That's also a really good point. Even if we got a solution that removed Assad from power, even if we got Russian cooperation to put greater pressure on Assad, even if we got an optimal U.S. best-case scenario, what happens next? That's always the critical question, whether it's removing Saddam from power in Iraq. That's a nation-building exercise. You have a war-torn country. You have psychological damage, people who have lived under ISIS's rule in places like Raqqa. This is a long-term endeavor if and when Assad does get removed from power. And if he doesn't, how to reach a solution where there's peace longer term, and who's going to govern. And, the individuals that have been under ISIS's rule, they're not going to just be okay because we get ISIS out of Raqqa. It's a longer-term project. It's a longer-term commitment in terms of hearts and minds, in terms of financial dollars, and in terms of, to be honest, U.S. advisors on the ground and our presence there.
Every layer is more complicated than the last. Tara Mahler, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.